Uh, so thanks again, Avi, for taking the time here today. For those who don't know Avi Nimani, I'm sorry, is going to enlighten us a little bit more on from a GovTech perspective. He has a lot of experience in this space. I'm really excited personally to learn here. And as I said, we will be recording this for those that aren't able to attend live. If you would like to get a copy of this afterwards, I'll make sure that everybody has that as well. So with that in mind, I will pass it off to Avi. Avi, the floor is yours, and you should be able to navigate the screen pretty well.
Great. Well, thanks, Michael. And I was laughing when he pronounced my name because we were just talking about it before we got on. And I was looking at my slides, and entrepreneurs, I've been working in entrepreneurship for the last 12 years, and I'm sure I've spelled it wrong in this deck 4 or 5 times. So just look out for that. But thanks, Michael. And I'm glad to be part of this and part of the SmartCityX program. I'm part of a lot of different accelerator programs working in GovTech, and I think this model is especially exciting. So glad to be a part of it. And for the folks who are not part of it, I would recommend checking it out, and we can talk more about it at the end. So I'm just going to take it over from here and jump in. Before we go into it, a little bit more of my background. As I mentioned, I've been doing GovTech for 12 years now, all of my career. I got started at a company called Code for America, which is jokingly called a Peace Corps for Geeks. It's a nonprofit that brought engineers and designers into local governments to help address problems that the cities had. So not like fixing the email, but like making new technology that helps the cities work better. And we'll talk about that. That's one type of technology, one way in which companies can work with cities. It's not the only way, but and we're going to talk more about those other ways too. After helping build Code for America, we grew it to a small company to working with about 100 or so cities in different capacities over 4 years. I went and worked for the city of Los Angeles as its first chief data officer, helping build its open data program, which we'll talk about as well, is another great aspect in the way you can work with, your company can work with governments. Or you as an individual can work with governments. And then I went to Sacramento, where I was the chief innovation officer. And there I was tasked with entrepreneurship and learning how to spell it. There we built the innovation office, which was a $10 million innovation fund that focused on recruiting startups into the city. Again, another thing we'll talk about later. And then for the last couple of years, I've been helping government startups, in particular, company folks that are selling technology to government, or folks that are just working in government but have a policy issue, which comes up really more often than you'd think, help them navigate that. So we're going to talk about what I call the A, B, C, and Ds of working smarter with cities, not necessarily smart cities. This is kind of my riff on that, just because I think you have to work with all cities, whether or not they're using advanced technology or not. It's an opportunity and just a reality. And so it means as companies, if you're coming from a company background, you have to rethink what government relations means in the 21st century. But before we do that, most of you probably don't know very much about City Hall or local government, aside from what you see on Parks and Rec, which is actually honestly not a terrible depiction. We can talk about that after the presentation. But what I wanted to do is just give you an introduction, kind of what I wish I knew when I was going into city government from day one. So first is cities aren't structured in the way you think they are. So most people think, based on watching TV shows or whatever, that and watching our understanding of federal politics, that the main person in charge of a city is the mayor, right? That he or she is the person driving decisions, for instance, would make decisions on what to buy if you're a software vendor, or make decisions on what policy to promote if, say, you're an Uber, right? In fact, the mayor has very little control over both operations and policy. He or she is just one stakeholder of many. In most cities, so let's separate those two things out, operations and policy, or for folks who are in MPA programs like me, administration and policy. So on the administration side, there's a city manager. That's an appointed person. That's a job that someone's hired for, who's basically the manager, the CEO of the city. We'll talk more about that in a second, who oversees department heads. That's like the director of transportation or the director of police, the chief of police. And then, of course, there's the departmental staff. These are the folks that actually like do the work of government in your city. And then the city manager is supported by a team of assistant city managers. That includes the public information officer and other senior staff, as they're known within the city, who do have oversight over the department heads and do citywide policy coordination. On the other side, then you have the city council and mayor, and what they really focus on is policy. So for instance, going back to the Uber case, what's the city's rules around changing our cab policy, right? Those are policy decisions that they collaborate on, the city council and the mayor, on setting, and in particular spend a lot of time figuring out the budget. So let's now, I threw a lot of terms at you, and let's go into depth. And I'll use this as a moment just to pause and explain the nature of this deck itself. The way I designed this and made this was that it's a resource for you all to have and use. There's actually a handout at the end that you can use as just a way to structure your own thinking around how to work with government. And so this is more text heavy than I normally would like to have, but hopefully this is details that you can use and reference later on. So let's just start at the top. City manager, as I said, this is a person who's basically responsible for the city, the CEO. The important things to note is that these folks are usually career administrators, right? These are folks who've been running cities or running departments for a while, or come from a business background, have been appointed to that. But this is more of a managerial and less of a political role. And the political role is where the mayor, the second piece, comes in, right? The mayors are often elected, sometimes not, sometimes it's rotating amongst the city council, but those are of course elected. And the mayor's main priority is almost always determining the budget or proposing the budget. So this is where it's similar to the federal government, where the president proposes the budget to Congress, which passes it. So the mayor does have authority and influence, I should say, when it comes to setting priorities around the budget. At the end of the day, it is the council that approves it, and then the city manager and the departments that actually execute against it. One note, if you're trying to sell to governments, mayors are typically where people want to focus their attention. It's actually not the best place to focus your attention because they tend to not have the most budget. There's exemptions to that, right? Like Chicago and New York are strong mayor cities. We'll talk about that next. But again, in most cases, you're going to see a strong city manager form of government, a manager council form of government, or council manager form of government. And in those cases, the mayor doesn't have a lot of authority and frankly doesn't have much budget. So next is the city council. These are folks that are elected and they approve the budget and regulation. And they're often deeply involved in departmental work as well. When I was CDO of LA, I would work closely with council members on issues in their districts, ranging from transportation to homelessness. So council members have a lot of influence and a lot of authority and are connected to the departments informally. Now, that said, they themselves don't have a lot of budget, but they control the city budget itself. So they can be influential in making budget buckets for the type of projects that you want to pursue. Next is like the IT manager or CIO. In some cases, that's going to be called the webmaster, which I know for some of us coming from the technology background might think is a bad word. It's not. Webmasters are an essential role in an IT organization, and oftentimes the only technologist within a city government. One thing that's been changing over the last couple of years is we've seen the elevation of folks with technical backgrounds within cities, which is exciting. And frankly, something I take a lot of pride in is seeing a lot of people that I respect getting more and more authority and influence within cities. So going from, say, a junior analyst to the CIO. Actually, one friend of mine, Luke Stowe, I want to call him out, recently just became the head of administrations of a city from formerly being the head of IT. So you're seeing folks with technical backgrounds grow, which means that they have more authority over budget. Again, we'll talk about that more in a second. So the CIO or IT manager serves as a department head. And department heads are basically when you're thinking about anything you want to get done within a city, again, be it policy, be it selling, department heads are where most of your focus should be, because they're the ones that have authority over the staff and can appropriate the budget, can decide on how to spend the budget that's been appropriated to them. And of course, the department staff report into them. Now, I'll flag this because, again, this is what we all think of when we think of cities, just because this is a model of city government that exists. And it's called the strong mayor system. This is where the mayor oversees and gets to hire and fire the department heads and has his or her own staff that they oversee as well. Separately, the city council does have a lot of influence as well, but it's only on policy. In terms of operations, it's really the mayors and the mayor's staff that oversee the day-to-day of city government. Key people to know. What I want to call first is what I describe as the tech C-suite. This is the chief information officer, the chief data officer, the chief technology officer. So this is like the dream scenario. This is like the Avengers assembled for city government. This is what it would look like. And that's happened in a few cities, but not often. What you end up seeing is one of these three things or two of them, or a hybrid of all three and one person or two people, right? But it's helpful, I think, intellectually to separate them out in this way so you can understand the different roles and how cities typically look at the different roles. So first and foremost is the chief information officer. As I just mentioned, this is the director of the IT department. This is the person who actually runs information and technology for the city, has a budget, and that person honestly is usually non-technical. That person is more of a business manager or product manager type of project manager type of background. Sometimes they're technical, but usually if you're the CIO of a mid to large size city, you're not coding most of the day. You're handling the department. Separately then, there's the chief technology officer. Now, this is an interesting distinction because that's emerged over time because the CIO is really focused on, the technology of the city, the day-to-day operations. That person's overseeing a department, right? So the chief technology officer came about. Sometimes this person's called the chief innovation officer. That was my title, because someone else needs to be thinking about what's next, right? So for instance, in Sacramento, I was working on making Sacramento a technology hub. The next CIO after me focused on making Sacramento a 5G hub, right? Separately, there was a CIO who was managing the city's IT department, Maria, who did things like upgrading our 311 system, right? Essential work, but different in kind, right? And then finally, there's a chief data officer. Again, much more of a new role inside local governments, but an emergent one indeed. And what the chief data officer does tends to vary. Sometimes it can be focused on open data, which we're going to talk about more in a minute, which is publishing all of the city's information openly and freely. What you're seeing more and more of is a focus on performance management. And so what they'll do is use the city's data internally to figure out key measures of what's going on, KPIs, and help inform policy, not policy, help inform administrative operational decisions to make the city more efficient. So sometimes it's going to be called a chief data officer. Sometimes they'll see it called as a chief performance officer. Sometimes it's the director of performance management. There's a lot of different titles, but it's usually a team or a person in charge of doing statistical work, like a business intelligence unit in a typical company. Now, other key players to know inside of city government is the city attorney. This isn't what you see on Law and Order. That's the district attorney. They try cases for the people regarding criminal matters. The city attorney is literally the city's lawyer. So when you're signing a contract with the city, it's going to be approved by the city attorney and or someone from the city attorney's office. And so when you think about people who mentioned like you have to go through a lot of hoops and burdens to work with the city, those hoops and burdens are maintained by the city attorney. Next is the controller, city treasurer. This is the person in charge of basically managing the city's budget. They have a lot of technical needs. That's why I call them out, and oftentimes understand the need for technology because they're working with data all the time. And then finally is the chief administrative officer. This is someone who can, the terminology varies. Sometimes it's a COO, sometimes it's a CAO, but this is the person who's in charge of making sure the city's in compliance with regulation. So takeaway from all of that, and sorry, that sounded like class, but that literally was a 101, is it's just people, right? People freak out about government thinking it's going to be complicated, it's going to be tough, it's going to be a lot to manage. It is, but at the end of the day, it's just people. And once you get to know them and get to work with them, it makes it a lot easier to work with them. So find ways to just engage, right? That's why I gave you the kind of lay of the land of who there is. And if you're working in transportation, right? And maybe you don't need to work with the city necessarily, it might be helpful to just know the city's transportation director. So just network as much as you can. Second is procurement is typically seen as a bad word. As I mentioned, there are those hoops and burdens. But again, if you know the right people, you can usually navigate it, right? I had a good friend of mine who didn't oversee procurement, but ran innovation in a major city. And he would always remind me that like, yes, procurement's hard, but if you're smart, hard problems are solvable, right? And these are solvable problems. So procurement may seem like a daunting task, but as I hopefully will encourage you later on, the government's such an attractive market, you can get through it. Again, if you know how to network and network with the right people. And the last thing I'll just say is like, these are big, messy systems. And at the end of the day, no one person really has authority. And I'm happy to admit this. And I was happy to admit when I was in government too, but now that I'm out, like when I had the title Chief Data Officer or Chief Innovation Officer, that might seem like I had a lot of influence, a lot of authority. And while, yeah, in Sacramento, we oversaw a $10 million fund, I didn't make any decisions alone. No one makes any decisions alone. Everything's done by committee, and everything's done through a process. So when you're talking to someone, expect that they have to talk to someone else to get approval. And that's my biggest piece of feedback to folks that I work with in my consulting company is plan on whatever you sharing with someone being shared with someone else. And in fact, optimize for it, right? So when you're reaching out to a government, draft that email in a way that it can be forwarded to someone else. And also, by the way, draft the email, assume that it's going to be public record because it is going to be public record. But just remember that no one person has authority, and so you have to work the system. All right, now that's the background. So the focus of today's talks is the A, B, C, and Ds of cities for startups. A as in access point, B as in barrier, C as in customer, and D as in data partner. And sorry if that sounds kind of tacky, but I figured this is an easy way to remember it. So the first question is, can government be an access point? And the answer is yes. But the question is really, how can a city help your business get up and running? And no matter what your business does, whether it's selling to government or not, you are going to be located in a city, or your whole team is going to be dispersed amongst many cities. And cities can be helpful as an access point in terms of getting yourself set up. And we'll talk about that in a moment. Next up is barrier. Can cities be a barrier? Indeed, they can, right? And so what does that mean for your company? If you're trying to say disrupt something, for instance, Uber is a classic example, but as we're seeing now with a lot of the policies around delivery companies, I've worked with drone companies, right? All of these issues are going to be disruptive in good ways, but also mean that there's going to be policy implications. So what does it mean to work with government as a barrier? And then is government a customer? Again, yes, it can be. And if you're part of the SmartCityX program, hopefully that's been made plain. And I'm going to try to explain kind of the opportunities and how to navigate the opportunities. And then finally, government as a data partner. So if you're not, say, working in government, are there ways in which government can help you? Yes, finally, the final way is as a data partner. Government has tons and tons and tons of data that you can use and help empower your business, or you can give your data to government to help the government. We're going to talk more about that. All right. First, government's access point. So everyone thinks that the only companies that are going to get the attention of a city government is like Amazon. I'm sure all of you remember the news and the buzz and all the competition around Amazon HQ2. Well, guess what? It's not just Amazon that cities care about. Cities care about all businesses, and they care about tech businesses because you are high growth companies, right? So there's the obvious reason, which is economics, and then there's the other reason, which is politics. Like cities like to look good, and city governments, city elected officials in particular like to look good, and it looks good to recruit new companies into your city. So there are ways in which cities can be helpful in terms of bringing you in, and I was going to go into depth here on what that means. So growth isn't just a startup term. Growth is a term for governments, right? One of their key indicators is economic development in the city. In fact, there's an entire department around economic development, right? So opportunities that are available to you for almost any city are deals on office space and parking, relocation incentives and grants, and introductions, connections, and more, which I'll talk about. But there are these lots of tools and resources that cities have for you, kind of like an accelerator program almost, to help you get ramped up and going within whatever city you decide to locate in. Of course, you all are probably located in a place right now, but in the future, if you're thinking about relocating, before you do, pick up the phone and call the economic development director in the city that you're thinking about. What I've seen some companies smartly do is actually compete against regional cities to get the best attractive deal. So that's something to keep in mind. And again, you don't have to be the size of Amazon to start having those conversations. So specifically then, people and organizations to know, as I mentioned, was the economic development director. Second, almost every city has like a regional economic development authority or a redevelopment authority. It's a quasi-governmental organization. Look into those. There's also usually a chambers of commerce. Those are usually paid organizations. So that's a little bit different, but we can talk about that if you're curious. And then finally, look for state grants and state grant makers. At the end, there's actually a nice service that I'll show you that you can do to find all grant opportunities. But there's usually some kind of grants available from the state to promote business. So if you're thinking about changing not just cities, but states, you should look at that. So I'm going to go into depth about how cities are proactively helping startups. And as an example of that, talk about what we did in Sacramento when I was there. So the city of Sacramento, when Mayor Kevin Johnson was the mayor, this was his last year in office, he wanted to end it with a bang, as he put it, go out strong. And so we wanted to focus on making Sacramento a hub for innovation and entrepreneurship. Now that can mean a lot of different things, and we had to talk about what that meant. But they brought me in to help focus on it. And what we decided to focus on was helping startups in Sacramento grow, right? And specifically help entrepreneurs within the city grow. There's some interesting debate around, do we want to encourage startups that are here or bring startups from outside? And we decided to do both. And so Sacramento actually became one of the first cities to be an LP in 500 startups. So it was investing directly in startups. And then we created a separate Rails program that incented entrepreneurs and entrepreneurs that were helping other entrepreneurs to grow the ecosystem within Sacramento. Now, the takeaway here is you should look this up. It's a great program if you're in Sacramento. But more importantly, cities have programs like this under different names, right? Just look up economic development or entrepreneurship in city X, and you're going to find resources within that city designed to help you as a company. And if they don't make sense, which they sometimes don't because the websites aren't always great, that's the next topic. Just pick up the phone and call. You're going to end up getting a lot of support through the city as a partner. Just check on time. All right, so next is government as a barrier. So honestly, sometimes government's going to be a friend, but sometimes it's going to be a foe, right? Sometimes you're going to have to deal with you wanting to do things that the government doesn't necessarily support. And that makes sense, right? Because think about it. These things didn't exist 20 years ago. Like, we didn't have drones. We didn't even have cell phones 20 years ago. Not like we have now. We didn't have smart cars. We didn't have sensors and everything. We definitely didn't have cryptocurrencies. I mean, if you want to have a philosophical debate on that, we can, but that's a whole different webinar. But literally, these things were not there. So there weren't policies to regulate them. And so that's changing, right? Or if they were there, the new technology, the new things that are emerging are replacing them. So new policies have to emerge, right? And so my general advice, well, generally I should say, I try to just provide frameworks and ways to think about things and not provide too much normative judgment. But this one I will say is taking the burn it all down approach that some startups have taken of saying, let's just disregard local government policy. I don't support. I think this might be because I come from a government background, but also I just think it's not a efficient way of getting the job done. And frankly, it's looking at governments as the enemy when they may have an opposed view, but really they're just people that have to work through a system like you. So what I recommend is a pretty straightforward strategy is just get ahead of it, right? So determine a strategy of engagement, right? What does it look like now in your city in terms of the policies regulating the activity that you're doing? And where do you want it to go, right? And then determine how you want to get there. So the first step to do that is probably finding policy examples. So if you're, say, working in drone or transportation or whatever, and there's a policy that's relevant to you, there's probably an organization that's done research on a best practice for that policy. And great sources of those best practices are the US Conference of Mayors, the International City Managers Association, ICMA, NLC, which is the National League of Cities, and Bloomberg Cities. It's funny. I have all these abbreviations in here, which is a symptom of me being a bureaucrat for so long. And these acronyms aren't going to mean anything to anyone who's not listening to the webinar. So I will update the slide with the actual names of the organizations and links to all of them. One other thing to note about these organizations is they are, organizations that need money. So if you're an organization that needs a policy drafted, needs support for a policy, organizations like those and other trade organizations are open to sponsorships where they'll do research around or help promote whatever policy you're working on. So once you have the policy and have that plan, you want to build a coalition, right, of folks locally. And we're not going to do a whole talk here about how you do that, but the folks to think about talking to are other companies that are working in the same space locally, look at the council members who might have relevance to the issue area that you care about. What I tend to tell people is like, usually there's 1 or 2 folks on the council who've made themselves known as like the tech or the innovation folks. So find out who they are and talk to them. And then of course, talk to the relevant departments. Because at the end of the day, again, if you're doing something with transportation, if you're doing something with buildings, you're going to end up working with the Department of Transportation or the Department of Buildings or the Department of Permitting. So get ahead of it and start talking to them and figuring out where they're coming from so you can have a plan. And then finally, the last piece of advice is when you're trying to get a city to change its policy or change its stance, try to position the city as a leader in something, right? Not as a follower. And this is a weird dynamic in cities where cities don't want to be the last one to the party, but they also don't want to be the first. So you want to make sure that you're positioning the city as part of a movement of cities doing something and not just as its own, or as positioning it as, oh, every other city's done this, you have to do this. That's not a very compelling position. The best way to position is, this is the movement and you can be part of this exciting new movement. All right, so next up is government as a customer. So this is pretty straightforward. It's government as a client, as a purchaser of the software you're selling. Most people think that this is maybe not the most exciting space. Many books here suggest otherwise. Hopefully this talk will suggest otherwise. But government is a huge market, if nothing else, right? From a simply profit incentive, government is a massive market opportunity. $200 billion is what government spends a year on technology, right? A year. To put that in context, the video game industry is 61 billion people, and the wearables industry is 42 billion. So we're talking 2 to 3x, 2 to 5x rather, what these other industries are at in just the US government market alone, right? Then think of the Japanese market, then think of the Chinese market, then think of the Russian market. So there's massive, massive opportunities because governments are businesses, right? And because governments are businesses, they have to buy things just like businesses do to do all of their operations. And a lot of what businesses do now is technology, right? So one thing to consider is just government as any other B2B play. There are particular things to keep in mind. What we're going to focus on today is the local government side of things. And I want to explain why local government matters. Most people focus a lot of their attention on the federal government, but I actually think there's more focus and attention that needs to be placed on the local side. And here's why, because it's actually a really big market and it's a market that you can sell to. So let's just break this down for a second. So again, if you look at the overall market, it's over $200 billion, but a lot of that, 37 billion at the federal level, is spent on defense. I think it's fair to put that in its own category because those are different types of contracts. That's different type of technology than kind of general, what we could describe as commercial software. But then, so if you take that out, then it's a much more even split, right? Between state, local, and federal. And in fact, local is a bigger market than federal. And here's the thing with local government when you're building a business, as all of you are, or many of you are, that's a repeatable process, right? If you sell to a city, if you sell to say like a mid-sized city like Sacramento, guess what? There's like 3,000 other cities just like Sacramento you can go sell to. And you can use the fact that you just sold to Sacramento as that test case to get the next client. And if you want more details on strategies of how to sell to government, happy to share that. There's some available online at the publicinnovation.academy, or happy to talk one-on-one with anybody about their particular business if they're thinking about selling to government. What I want to say, though, is to folks who aren't selling to government now, you should really consider it because the revolution is just beginning, as it were, right? Like current IT expenditure is just a reflection of the money government spends now on software. But if you follow the saying that software is eating the world, and eventually almost every aspect of what we do is going to have a software component to it or a technology component to it, at least, then all of government expenditure, which by the way is the largest driver of the larger sector of the economy, the government entire market becomes really exciting. So some of the opportunities to think about are remote work and coordinating around remote work, for instance, right? Like Zoom, which we're using now, sells a lot of software to government. So you could think about opportunities like that. Automated communication and processing is a big trend inside government. I like to make the joke that basically all government software is just a web form. That's not true. That's what we all see on our side as citizens. On the other side is a lot of old legacy software that's effectively just workflow software, right? If you're technical at all, you'll understand what I'm saying. It's all about just notifications of letting people know and people updating databases and software layered on top of to do that. Well, you can automate a lot of that now, and you can build a lot better tools for communication than we had 20 years ago, right? And do it a lot cheaper and a lot faster. So when you look at so what I recommend to people is when you look at any government process that's frustrating you, right? Like people love to complain about the DMV. But for instance, take the vaccine registration process, right? When you see that government process and you're like, this is frustrating, ask yourself why. And the answer is probably, oh, there's a process that has to happen in the background for this to happen. And then think, could I build technology that makes that process easier? And a classic example that's a contemporary example is a lot of states, for instance, are passing cannabis regulations now to allow recreational cannabis usage. Well, guess what? That's an entire new process that the state has to manage. So everything from getting your business itself registered to sell, that's a piece of technology, right? From a citizen registering for a cannabis card, that's a piece of technology, right? So each of these aspects are a piece of technology. And so when you start looking at government operations, you see lots and lots of opportunity. So my point is, if your company is working on digital transformation in any sector, you have to consider those same opportunities in the government sector. All right, next and finally up is government as a platform, or rather government as a data partner, to stick with my ABCD thing. And now I'm regretting the ABCD thing, but sorry. The last piece is basically open data and the role data can play between governments and cities. Now, I want to explain this term because you've probably heard it sometimes, or you might hear it in the future, is this notion of government as a platform or open government. Those terms are basically synonymous and interchangeable. And what they really mean is that a government is committed to publishing its data openly and freely as a public asset, right? If you think about it, it makes sense, right? Like we pay for government. So theoretically, everything government does should be ours. Of course, there's a lot of IP stuff that we can get into, so it's not always the case. But there's a pretty strong argument that the data a government produces should be publicly available to us as citizens, just because we paid for it. But also from a constitutional perspective, there's freedom of speech and freedom of access and FOIA rules, legal rules that require the government to be public with its information. So they're basically differing degrees of it, how open a government is or how much of a platform a government's operating. But that's the way to think about it. And so an example that I think encapsulates all the various different elements of it. There's some questions here in the chat, but we'll get to at the end. So in LA, I was in charge of the open data program. And one partnership we did around open data was working with Waze. So I'm going to give some context here, and I think this will answer one of the questions. So cities have lots and lots of data, right? That ranges from crime data, right? All of the robberies last year to all of the pets at the zoo, right? A hilarious conversation I had was with zoo staff, and I was trying to get data from them, and they couldn't think of any data sets. And I was like, well, don't you have a list of all of the animals at the zoo? And they're like, oh yeah. So one challenge is people don't always realize what data they have. But there's a lot of it out there. And it's there somewhere, right? It's either on a spreadsheet somewhere. But again, if a government's working as a platform, and I'll talk about this later, you're going to see it on a data portal that they have. But a problem with that is not your regular human is just going to go to the open data portal on a government website every day, right? That's not what people do for fun. I mean, I do that for fun, but I'm a special case. Normal people, if they want government data, for instance, the weather, they want to get it from like their cell phone, right? On the weather app, or they want to get it from Alexa or wherever, right? So a big question is how you get this important data government has into the hands of citizens, right? We've solved that problem with weather, right? That is government-owned data that's now publicly available for everyone through a company that does that. That's an emergent opportunity for other companies now to think of creative ways to integrate government data into their services. And so we thought of that well, we didn't think of it. We wanted to pursue that in LA, this question of how you integrate government data into digital services that are already existing. And we made a partnership with Waze, where they would include our road closure information. I don't know if any of you are from Los Angeles or spend any time there, but apparently traffic's a thing there. So people like using Waze to get around traffic. One source of traffic, I'm told, is road closures. I tend to walk everywhere. But so Waze finds a lot of value in that data, our road closure data. And of course we have it because we're the ones closing the roads, we being the city government. So it's actually a little bit more complicated than that. We had to get the data from various different departments because the road closure data isn't in just one place. It's in the transportation department, it's in the public works department that's fixing the streets, et cetera, et cetera. But once the city pulled that together, we got a data stream, provided that to Waze, and then Waze included that in their app, helping citizens and helping them as a company. On the flip side, we asked for something in return, which is we wanted to be able to alert citizens, because Waze has citizens' attention at a vital time, to important things like a hit and run, right? So when there's something that's a public safety alert, there are Amber alerts, but those are a different channel. We wanted to have our own channel as a city from LAPD to be able to alert people what was going on, and Waze built that in. So I thought that was a good example of the various different ways in which, Waze, funny, that was accidental, ways in which cities and companies can work together around data. Now, to explain that, to understand that in more detail, you can look at it in these three ways, right? One is an open data powered business, right? Your company can literally use open data as a source and kind of impetus for its business, and companies have been very successful doing that. And one thing I'd recommend doing is going to data.gov, as you can see there, which is the national portal in the US of all publicly available government data. They pull together all the open data from the cities and counties into one place. Look there and just find interesting things. There's some great stories, like Brightscope is a company I'd look at. One that I'll touch on is Aunt Bertha, which relies on open data, or Turbo SBIR as well. Both of these companies use data that the government has. For instance, Aunt Bertha uses data around social service information, where our homelessness shelters, et cetera. Turbo SBR uses information about federal grants, and then they create better interfaces on top of it and then sell those better interfaces to people, right? Aunt Bertha sells that to social service providers so they can have better sense of the landscape. Turbo SBIR sells that to companies. Actually, they provide for free now to companies, so definitely check it out. And they have another revenue source, but they provide that as a service then to their constituency. So if you're, you may already be in this space. If not, it's something to think about if you're an entrepreneur, as a way to generate value, is using open data as your basically raw materials for your business. My friend Anish Chopra likes to say, open data can be jet fuel for innovation and for entrepreneurship. And I think it can. I'm a little bit more skeptical on how it can be really, really as exciting as some people think it can be, but I do think it can be very valuable if used thoughtfully. And speaking to that, a second way in which you can use open data is just benefit from it, right? Use it in a small way. So add it to your existing service. The Waze example is a classic example of that. So is Yelp. We did a project when I was at Code for America to integrate restaurant inspection scores, which are typically hidden in the back of a restaurant where no one's going to find them, and brought them into Yelp, where everyone's going to see them critically before they decide which restaurant to go to. So that was a company using government data to make their service better. Zillow does the same thing with code enforcement data. And I just saw DoorDash does that with plastic, with recycling information. So there are more and more ways in which companies are doing that. And then finally, there's companies that benefit from data deals, right? So these are heavier private data, not open data typically, where they're getting access to a lot of sensitive government data, or just a lot of government data. It may not be sensitive, but a lot of it. And so they have to set up a special relationship. So a good example of that is Palantir, right, which goes into law enforcement agencies or defense agencies and pulls together lots of data and makes sense of it in a coherent way. Or a Google or an Apple, when they're getting real-time transit information from a government, that's a lot of data, so they have to set up custom feeds for that. All right, so sorry, I keep trying to. In conclusion, I think there's never been a more important time to be good at what we do. I'm using we here generally because I'm assuming you all now are part of the Smart City family, if you weren't before. Because we can see it all around us, right? We see what's happening in the world. We see what COVID's done to every country, every city. And there's just a need for public services to work better.